This is the Bama Podcast with Marty Solomon. I'm his co-host, Brent Billings. Today we are joined by Kat Armas, author of Abuelita Faith. Her earliest theological formation came from her grandmother and ultimately inspired her to tell the stories of those we find on the margins. She teaches people to reflect on the abuelitas in their lives and shows us how to live out this kind of faith on a daily basis. So, Kat, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
And if you want to add anything at all to my introduction, that is a very condensed version of what you're all about. So tell us a little more about yourself in your own words.
Sure. So I received a Master of Divinity and a Master of Arts in Theology from Fuller Seminary a couple years ago, and I'm currently at Vanderbilt studying now under Dr. Segovia and kind of focusing on post-colonial biblical studies and things like that, which, you know, there's a lot that goes into that. I'm also a new mom, and so I've just been, you know, figuring out this whole raising a human thing, which has been so hard and so fun and just so completely life-changing. So, just trying to get my bearings as I continue to move forward in just my work. I also finished the manuscript to my second book. So, just doing taking some time off after a lot of writing and a lot of studying.
That's beautiful. Somebody linked something you tagged or something. Somebody said, "Hey, Kat just mentioned Bema, and she's a really cool voice. You ought to check this out." So I remember jumping over on Twitter and finding some stuff and thinking, man, I think at that point, maybe you were, and maybe you still do some freelance writing with some different magazines and journals and that kind of stuff. And I was like, oh, this is really great. I love this. And so I've been following you from a distance, Kat, but this is the first time we've gotten to actually chat today. And just really, I've just really enjoyed, I've been learning from you, and you've been teaching me so much, and it's been just been really good and refreshing. And I know other people, students of mine, have been connected and influenced by your work, and it's just been super good. So can you tell us, Kat, a little bit about what you do? Like, you do a lot of things, but tell us about kind of like what you do and how that intersects with what the world needs. What's this intersection between who Kat is and what God's doing in the world?
Yeah, thank you for asking. And thank you so much for your just encouraging words. So I think, you know, actually you and I do a lot of the same things in that I really want to make theology, spirituality, the Bible, accessible, right? I want folks, particularly folks in my community, I'm Cuban American, originally from Miami. And so I speak very much through that lens as someone who was raised as my culture being the dominant culture. Being a Cuban from Miami means that, predominantly most of the people who surrounded me growing up were Cuban American, or if not Latino, Latina, Latine. So I think it's important to make theology accessible to folks and just kind of invite folks into what it means to read the Bible or understand their faith through the lens of my people or my culture, which is going to look different and it's going to feel different. It's going to land differently than maybe the way that many of us were taught in seminaries, including myself. I have a couple degrees. I've been to seminary, and that's really where a lot of this was sparked from. I felt like most of my classes and a lot of what I was learning, I didn't resonate with it. I felt further from God after taking, Bible classes and taking all these sort of theology classes. I literally felt like I knew, I felt like I knew God less. Right.
Yes.
So I feel really passionate about communicating sort of, just the lens through which I understand God and the lens through which I understand Scripture and communicating that to folks. And I've done that in different ways. I've worked actually in campus ministry. I did that for a little bit and connecting with the Latino community there. I've also worked with young folks. I've worked, I was employed at the Fuller Youth Institute. And so I did some writing there. And right now, I'm just continuing to write and research and create content for my community, but not, predominantly, not only for my community, but for just the general folks who are interested in learning about God through a different perspective.
I didn't know about that campus ministry overlap. I sensed that. I knew that there was something there. So really interesting to know that. And we have more conversations we could have about that. That's excellent.
Yeah. No, that would be great. Yeah.
So as far as your Cuban background, like, I'm not familiar with Cuba at all, and I can't really, truly say that I've been to Miami. I have technically been there, but I can't really say that. Like, what makes it distinct from maybe other Latin cultures that, maybe people are more familiar with Mexico because they've,
Right.
I mean, not that you really necessarily get that when you vacation there necessarily, but like maybe some people are familiar with other communities, but what makes your Cuban culture or your Cuban American culture distinct? And I don't even know if I'm equipped to understand the distinctions, but tell me a little bit about that and like what you think that brings to your work.
Yeah, and that's a great question because I do feel like a lot of folks in the, Latinx community, we do get lumped into like Latinx or, Latinos, and, we are all so vastly different. So I come from a Caribbean culture. So, Cubans and Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, a lot of us, we kind of stick to like our own sort of Caribbean feel and with the very tropical, like, I mean, obviously Miami, Miami is called the Latin American capital of the U.S. It's, I know many folks kind of know it as that. And also Cuba just has like a very, very complicated history. And I talk about this in Abuelita Faith, and I try not to go into too much detail because when I say too much detail, I just mean too much political, sort of talk about Cuba because it is, I mean, it's very polarized. My family, they left Cuba in the height of the Castro Revolution. And, my family was not rich by any means when they left, but they were part of the fortunate people that were able to leave when they did. And then when they got to Miami, Miami was a haven for a lot of Cuban immigrants and a lot of exile, a lot of people, folks who were leaving, and a lot of folks during that time. And, the U.S. welcomed them with open arms because they loved, the anti-communist rhetoric. And, they were like, yes, this fits into what we're, where we're at right now. And so compared to a lot of other immigrant communities, Cubans were very much welcomed into the U.S. during that time. And so my family is very much, they have very strong views about, what they believe. And they're very thankful to the U.S., which, granted, of course, anyone would be. But yeah, so it just the Cuban history, again, it's just very complicated. There's just a lot that goes into that. I talk in Abuelita Faith, I talk about empire and how, empire sort of puts folks in vulnerable situations and then convinces them that only they can save them from their vulnerability. And I feel like that's a lot of what happened to, Cuba and to the Cuban people, in regard to the US, like we are the empire. We are going to put you in a vulnerable position, but look, we saved you. So therefore, you must worship us. Right. And so, yeah, so it's just very complicated. But Miami and specifically, I mean, it is just like, everyone who raised me, everyone who I knew, all of my teachers, everyone, was part of my community, right? They spoke Spanish. I was raised, Spanish is my first language, and I ate only my food from my culture, and that was all I knew. And it wasn't until I left Miami as an adult, and I moved to the South that I realized, wait a minute, my culture is not the dominant culture, right? It was in that very small bubble that was Miami, but it's not like this everywhere else, right? And that was the first time that I was really met with, just the demons of ethno-racism. And also, I was raised by a single mother and a single grandmother. And so all of a sudden I'm put into, I'm taken out of that context where, women were very much celebrated and supported because there was no choice but to be, right? I mean, my mother and my grandmother as single women, they were mother and father, and they raised me to be, confident and independent and all of these things. So all of a sudden I get, I leave that sort of bubble that I was raised in, and I arrive in a culture where that's not the norm, right? Women have to very much be a certain way and act a certain way and submit a certain way. And so there was a lot of different cultural shocks, and I experienced a lot of different, just a shock when I left Miami because I'm a woman, because I was Cuban, and just, kind of coming to terms with, okay, so what does it mean to be me outside of my bubble? And by bubble, I just mean outside of where my culture is the dominant culture.
Man, I feel like we could talk about that for another 2 hours.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a lot in there, but that empire bit about, man, we saved you, now you, boy, oh, sheesh. There's a whole podcast episode in there. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Kat, let's talk about some of the things that you've written and you've created. First of all, let's talk about this podcast that I've read about, the Protagonistas. Tell me about this.
Yeah, thanks for asking. So the Protagonistas was sort of birthed from my experience. So I went from, as I mentioned, that my time in Miami, and then I went to seminary in a very, white conservative space, which again was just very different than what I was raised from. And so for me, as I mentioned earlier, kind of learning about God, I felt very disconnected. A lot of my professors were from like rural farm towns, which is perfectly fine, but it just had nothing to do with my experience, And so when they would talk about God or teach about God, I just felt like I couldn't really connect. And so, I ended up leaving that seminary and trying to look for a space where I felt like, could speak more to me as a Cuban and as a woman. And then that's sort of where I began, I met so many women who were doing such incredible work, and so many women, women of color in particular, who were really leaning into their cultural identity and the spirituality that they came from, like in their culture and their family. And I realized, like, wait a minute, at this point, it had been 2 years in seminary, and I had not learned from a woman. I had not learned from a woman of color in particular. And so much of what I understood about theology and understood about God was just not from, I keep mentioning my experiences. And so I thought, okay, I know I'm meeting so many women and women of color who are doing incredible things. Let me just have conversations with them. I was like, let me just record it. And so, and I have a line in Abuelita Faith that also speaks to this. I thought, what if women, particularly marginalized women, what if they were protagonists of their own stories? Too many times women are the heroes of someone else's stories, or someone else is the hero of their story. But what if they're just like the heroes of their own stories, and that's where, the Protagonistas, I originally wanted it to be like a 10-part miniseries. I just wanted to, talk to 10 really amazing women and women of color. And then people just started listening to it. And then I was, they kept asking for more. And I was like, okay, let's keep this going. So it's been going for like almost 5 years now. I've been taking a little break, just, new mom and just needed some time off. But yeah, I just wanted to hear from women of color just doing amazing things.
I love that. Something that we've been wanting to get more curious about here. So if people want to move at an even faster clip and do a deeper dive and get more than what we're doing, which isn't much and isn't enough, to be honest, it sounds like a great place to go over and hear more of those voices. So I love that. I love that.
Yeah. And what I love about a podcast like that is not only do you get different voices from different perspectives, but you just get this huge range of topics. Like I didn't know I needed to listen to a podcast about adoption, but there was in the feed, and it's like, oh wow, that's such an interesting, because I'm actually adopted, but I feel like my adoption experience is very different than I think most people. So it was really cool to get that different perspective, and also someone from a different culture. But yeah, there's so many great episodes there about marriage, about Encanto. I loved the Encanto episode.
Yeah, that one was fun.
So yeah, it's great because like week to week, month to month, you're not going to know what's going to show up. But then if you're just open to whatever it is, it's like you're going to learn something. So
great,
I've really enjoyed your podcast.
Thank you
but
so
maybe
much.
tell us some more about your book, Abuelita Faith, also available in Spanish, by the way.
Yes.
Abuelita Faith. I'll link to both of those in our show notes. But I just love that it's available, because we've had people who are actually working on translating Bema into Spanish. And we've asked them about like, hey, when we recommend a book, like, can you even get this? Like, is this available? And basically the answer is no in almost every case. So I love being able to provide that resource that's already in their language. So
awesome. Yes. Yeah. That was actually part of my contract. I made sure that was in there. Like, this book needs to be in Spanish. So I'm super happy. It came out, July 19th, which was yesterday, but when you hear this, it'll be a few months past. But super excited about that. And my book, so sort of the central question that I ask is, what if the greatest theologians the world has ever known are those whom the world wouldn't consider theologians at all? And so what I'm looking at is just, who are the unnamed and overlooked women in the Bible throughout history and in our, lives that have gone unnoticed or, just overlooked as genuine teachers or genuine theologians, right? We tend to look to those who are quote unquote formally educated, right? And nothing against having degrees. I have them, I've been formally educated, but when I read the Bible and particularly the stories of women, I see that there is, God calls so many women blessed who, are sometimes even nameless in stories, right? They have no names. You have the story of Rizpah, who she, brings forth rain after a 3-year famine, all because of her protest for, the unjust murder of her sons. So many women are just living and surviving, and they are, they change history, A, or B, Jesus notices them specifically. I'm thinking about the Canaanite mother, right, who has this theological exchange with Jesus. And these women, their stories go untold. They're just kind of like side stories. And so I'm arguing that, no, what if those are our greatest teachers, right? Instead of looking to just the pulpit and looking to those who are, again, formally educated, the white men who have all of the resources and the knowledge. What if we look to those who have the life experience, right? And I go through my grandmother's story sort of as an example of this and how she was a theologian. She was a teacher. No, she didn't lead a Bible study or she didn't, preach a sermon. But the way that she lived her life through, and I argue in Abuelita Faith very much so for an embodied spirituality, how she used her body and how she used her wisdom through lived experience. And how, that is that there's so much, not just so much, but I feel like we can learn the most about God, about the divine, about spirituality from these people and stories and, women, marginalized women, our abuelitas, our grandmothers. And I also, one of the other things that I sort of argue is this notion of survival. And I know I mentioned it briefly, but, so many of the women in scripture are literally just trying to survive. We love to spiritualize the stories of Ruth and Naomi, but it's they're just trying to Ruth is just trying to secure herself a husband so that she can live, right? So that she can, a lot of times we spiritualize some of these, which is fine. I think there's a space for spiritualizing them, but at the end of the day, a lot of these women were just trying to survive. And so I like to argue that, survival is in and of itself a holy endeavor. Survival is sacred. And we see that over and over and over again in scripture where, folks are just trying to survive and they are blessed by God for it.
Yeah, I actually recently did a study on Hagar where I was just looking at her story. And it's I've read about Hagar so many times, but it's always been in the context of the story of Abraham.
Right.
And just looking at her parts of the story and have Abraham coming in and being the side character just gave me a whole new perspective on it. And it was wild. So even the women in the Bible whose stories are maybe a little bit bigger, maybe a little bit more integrated, we know more about them, separating out the bigger story around them and just focusing on them is really illuminating too.
Right. Yeah,
so,
definitely.
Yeah, that's great. And I love one of the interviews you did on your podcast, somebody was talking about one of the chapters in your book where you're telling a story and they were just so surprised that you told that story. They're it would have been so easy for you to tell a different kind of story or tell a more personal, reflective story, but you chose this person and brought them in. And I'm that's what's so great about it.
Yeah, I think, that's part of what I'm trying to do is just illuminate these stories that are hard and they're hard to understand and they're complicated and they're, but that's part of it, right? Sitting in that tension and sitting in that really complicated story and letting it move us however it does. I love talking about, in Abuelita Faith, I bring up the wise women of Tekwa and, how we don't really know much about these women, we don't know much about this woman and we just know that she's wise and and, she sought out, for her wisdom, and she ends up like, completely, again, like changing the course of history. But again, we don't know much about her, and her story is just like this passing story. But yeah, when we just stop and focus and just ask questions about it, even if they're not, specifically answered, there's so much that our theological imaginations can do, right? Our theological imaginations can really soar when we give ourselves the space to just sit in the complicated stories, like you mentioned, in the common ones that, maybe if we look at it in a new light, we might find new wisdom. And, of course, the Bible was written by men for men. And so, we don't get a lot of these women's stories are very short, couple sentences. But I like to just sit in them and just, wonder and just, like I said, let my theological imagination sort of just soar.
You said a bunch of, you may have already answered my next question here. You mentioned in there the importance of asking questions, because these stories are, they're complex, they're nuanced, they're hard, they're difficult, and so you speak of asking questions. And one of the things I've enjoyed kind of watching you, I keep saying from a distance because it sounds so weird to be like watching you online. But I've really appreciated just part of what I've gotten in your content is the work that you do to turn up the volume on those voices that have been marginalized or silenced. And I feel like I'm so far behind you as I just learn from people like you. But what advice can you give somebody like myself or any of our other listeners that are just trying to like humbly walk towards a more curious, a more empathetic, like I hear that in what you're talking about. You're talking about curiosity. You're talking about asking questions. You're talking about compassion and caring for people. So you're talking about empathy. For those of us that are just trying to have a more compassionate pursuit of mercy and justice in the world, what's some of like the most basic advice you can give to somebody like me who I'm almost ashamed to say I feel like I'm just barely getting started and feel so ignorant still?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So one thing comes to mind, and I've shared this, in podcasts before, but I always think of this, of how Jesus was a really good guest. And what I mean by that is that Jesus, when we think of Christianity, a lot of times, like, being hospitality or being a good host is, a value that we have or something that we're taught that we should pursue. But Jesus didn't really he wasn't a host a lot of times. Like, he went to people's houses and he sat at unfamiliar tables, right? And he just learned and listened. And, obviously he taught, but, I just like to think of Jesus coming into someone else's home and just sitting at their table and eating what they offer. And, going back to this idea of an abuelita theology or an abuelita faith, I was always a guest at my grandmother's table. My grandmother was the host and it was her table. And anytime someone would come to the house, and her house was always full of guests, right? Because she cooked and she sewed, and she had her own sewing little business from home, and folks from the community would come and she would make clothes for them and she would cook for them and all of these things. But it was her table, right? And we would just sit, and whatever she wanted to feed us, we ate. And she was the dominant one at the table, right? And so when I think of Jesus being a guest, I think of, and my book talks a lot about this notion of decolonizing or decolonizing our view of Christianity or spirituality, and I think, it's a very colonial mindset to think that we have everything there is to teach, right? That we are the teachers and that we are the only hosts and that folks have to come sit at our tables and that, again, I've been talking about the formal degrees and all that, but that's the way that we're positioned, right? As leaders, that we're positioned to be the ones to teach and to lead. But what if we were just really good guests like Jesus? What if we just sat at unfamiliar tables and just allowed ourselves to be taught with no agenda or no, so I think about that a lot because I think about, what would it mean for Christians, those with power and those with privilege, to give up that power and privilege in order to let someone else be the one with power and privilege. And in that sense, to be a host, right? And to just be a guest to those who are, without power or privilege. And there's another thing that kind of goes along with that. So like I've mentioned, I'm a new mom, and I listen to, I read a lot of like parenting advice or parenting little blogs or whatever. And one of my favorite little things that I've read recently, and it's like, when you have a toddler, my baby's still like a very small baby, but, I'm reading stuff about when she's a toddler, and like when you have a toddler and, they're kind of playing with something, or they're, they have a little toy and they're kind of into their toy. We're kind of, it's instinct for us as adults, as the ones who know everything, who have the knowledge, right? To come up to like our kid and constantly like, hey, what is that? This is how you play with that, like trying to like guide them and how to, how many do you see? Do you see 1, 2, 3, and constantly be just trying to use that opportunity as a learning opportunity without trusting that. What if they're already learning? What if they're already like their minds are doing something? You don't have to step in. You can kind of just like let them be, right? And so some of the things that I read, it says that, instead of asking them how many or asking them to count or to tell you a color, just say nothing, right? And I just love that. I felt like it's been such a good piece of advice, like just say nothing. And I think about that also when I think of this, this notion of being a good guest, and today I actually posted, I tweeted, Jesus, he asked like 300 questions. And, there's like an account of like hundreds and hundreds of questions that Jesus asked, but he was just like curious, right? But like, he didn't try and like all the time just give a response or have all the answers, or, he was just kind of letting folks figure it out, right? So I think of being a good guest, or I think of being curious. I think of maybe sometimes saying absolutely nothing and trusting that the Holy Spirit, or, trusting that God is speaking to folks. I don't know if that answers your question, but those are some of the things that come to mind.
Answers it like unbelievably well. It's just convicting. It's such the guest comment. I'd never realized or considered how allowing yourself to be the guest actually allows you to center that other. I mean, part of what I'm learning about is I'm a part of the normative experience. I have the white male experience in life, and I'm just so used to being the center of gravity and always centering myself. And I'm learning one of the best things I can do is to allow others to be centered. And I never thought about the relationship of, especially Jesus being our model. I mean, if anybody had something to say all the time,
right?
If anybody in all of human history would have had like the excuse to be like, no, I always have something to give,
right?
To be the center of every experience, it would have been Jesus. Right. And yet Jesus routinely, in Pharisees' homes, in the homes of women, in the homes of outsiders and rejects, social rejects, like he allows himself to be served so that they can, what a fascinating, fantastic picture that I'm going to take with me. That's so great.
Yeah. Like I think of the woman at Bethany who poured the oil over him, and he just kind of sat there quietly and let her do it. Right. I love that. Like he just sat there and just like, okay, just do this thing that you feel like you need to do or you want to do, or, and then I also think of how we constantly hear and privilege and power, there are varying levels of it. And I consider myself as someone who upholds certain aspects of privilege and power because I'm educated and my documentation status and all of these things. But even, we always hear like, be the voice for the voiceless, or, speak up on behalf of those who don't have a voice. And it's like, everyone has a voice. I mean, granted, not everyone, right? But like people have voices. Like maybe your job is to say nothing or, to be a really good guest so that their voice may be heard, right? So I think, it kind of goes along with all of that. And as you mentioned, like Jesus is the perfect model of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was also thinking about how you're talking about watching, kids play with toys or whatever. And I have an almost 4-year-old and a 1-year-old. And so I'm actually getting this interesting perspective where I've been through it with one child and those toys were, forgotten about or whatever and put away. And now they're being brought back out for my second child, and seeing how my first child tries to either just take over entirely and not let the other one play, or like different toys where it's like, okay, here's what you do with this. And just, and I do try to like step back and let them play, but it's like, okay, here's what this can do. And then he doesn't do that at all. And it's like, okay, well, I guess he's not going to do that. Sure. But then bring it out the second time. And he just walks up, hasn't seen the thing in 2 years, and just does exactly as it's designed. It's like, that is so interesting that he just like somehow knows that.
Right.
So yeah, just giving our kids the opportunity to do that, because, is there really a right way to play with a toy? Like
exactly.
at different times in life, I think it's going to be a different way of engaging it. So I love that illustration.
Yeah. Because we feel the need to have to step in and, just as those in that relationship with power, right? To teach and to show. And this is how, but they're like, look, I got it. This is how I want to play with it right now. And this is how I'll play with it in 2 years, like I got it. Just, and it's a matter of just trusting your kids, but just trusting folks in general, right? Trusting that God is working in folks in different ways. I mean, just to give obviously a more spiritual, general idea of it, but yeah, it's the same idea.
Well, and saying like the kingdom of God belongs to the children.
Yes.
It's like, okay, so what really, like we need to be stepping back and learning from the way they're engaging this, because it's like they're playing with it, quote unquote, wrong.
Right.
And yet they're having so much fun. There's so much joy. They're so proud of it.
Right.
Yeah. Kat, tell me a little bit about the people you work with. I assume that, I don't know if you have like a formal team, but like, you don't work by yourself necessarily. You're part of different groups and communities and whatever. So tell me something about those people who, and maybe some of them have already been mentioned, but tell me about them. And then what are some things that you have learned from them?
Yeah. So, the first that I can think of is just, my community, my Cuban community, my Latinx community. And really just, your question is, what have I learned from them? Literally just what it means to be human, what it means to survive, and how complicated that is, right? I think of just the way that wisdom looks so different in so many different circumstances, in so many different spaces. It's funny, I actually think of this in terms of scripture. I think it's in Proverbs, is it 24, maybe verses 5 and 6, where it says like, don't answer a fool according to his folly, or you'll be just like him, or something like that. And then the very next verse says, answer a fool according to his folly, or else, something, right? It's like the complete, like, opposite instruction, like the verse right next to it. And I just absolutely adore that, because I feel like that is the perfect picture of just life, right? And that's something that, I've learned so much from my community, is just how wisdom is so contextual, right? And also just so much from my community of how so many of us are looking back to, and by my community, I also mean just a lot of like my Latinx friends that are writers, and that, we're in groups together, and we, kind of learn from each other, and how we're all looking back, to the faith of our ancestors, and really just trying to, when I say decolonize, that's really what I'm trying to do, is look backwards, which again is a completely biblical idea, right? Like God is constantly telling God's people, remember your ancestors, remember who you came from. And that's really where this idea of an abuelita theology came from, right? It's in First Timothy, where Paul says, I remember your ancestors, right? Your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice. And he sort of like builds this entire thing off of his mother and his grandmother, So that's where this idea of abuelita theology came from. And really so much of what I'm trying to do just within my own community, many of us are looking back to the faith of our ancestors, looking back to the faith of, like what was Christianity like in Cuba, when it first arrived? Like how did we get to where we are? And of course, a lot of it is tied to colonialism and imperialism and empire. And so what does it mean to detangle ourselves from that? And what does it mean to hold on to the things that are life-giving and beautiful? And what does it mean to let go of that which, is the opposite, right? And so I've just been learning so much about that, what it means to honor our ancestors, what it means to look back to the faith from which we come from, what it means to remember. And many of us in my community are on that journey as we are, reconnecting with what it means to be people of color, what it means to be, folks who don't have predominantly white experiences, or folks who, just don't, just have all sorts of different, backgrounds. And so that's a lot of what we're learning, what we're wrestling with right now.
All right, so tell us about this next book you're working on, and what is it about, and what are you talking about there? I'm assuming that you're excited to talk about this new work that you're putting out into the world.
Yes, I am. We actually, my publisher and I, my publisher Brazos Press, we're really excited about reclaiming this devotional space. Right? There's a lot of devotionals out there, but we wanted to do something different. And by we, I mean, I really, really wanted to do just something fun and different and exciting when it comes to a devotional. I wanted a devotional that asks us to think deeply and to be curious about things that we maybe have never thought of. And so I look at, there's 5 sections, and I just look at scripture through the feminine, the body. I look at scripture through nature. So I'm looking at Bible verses who talk about nature, and I just want to invite folks into an embodied spirituality through scripture and just different experiences in my own life.
Do you know when it will be published?
Next summer. So there's still a little bit. So I'm sure I'll be talking about it more and more as it gets closer, but we're still in the beginning stages.
Gotcha. Well, we do have a lot of people who listen, pretty shortly after release, but also lots of people who are coming to it later. So whenever that is available, I will put the link for that in the show notes as well.
Thank you so much.
Tell me about, I don't know, your experience in this world of restorative justice. I think in a lot of ways, looking ahead to that can feel a little bit hopeless, like we're never going to get there. So maybe you can encourage us a little bit on progress that you're seeing in that world, and maybe make some suggestions on how we could help further that cause.
Well, so I think of one thing. So, Solomon says there's nothing new under the sun, right? But then I also think of how Octavia Butler says, but there are new suns. And I feel like, and I do feel like, we're seeing a lot of new sun moments, right? There's just a lot going on. But I feel I feel hopeful. I feel hopeful about where we're headed. I feel hopeful, about those of us who are just been given more and more opportunities to share our stories and to share, to kind of create new theologies, even for me to be able to say, this is what an abuelita theology is, that's so exciting for me. And I know that it's blessed a lot of people in my community, because not just, I didn't come up with it, but I was able to, again, in community come up with it, right? We were able to, like we say in Spanish, en conjunto, we do this together, right? And that's what theology is done. Theology is done together. We do this around the table. We do theology in community. And so, I feel hopeful about that. And as far as any encouragement about what I'm seeing, I'm seeing, so actually I thought about this. One of my favorite episodes of the Bema podcast is the episode of Jonah. And I listened to it, and it just got me on this whole rabbit trail. And I recite it in my upcoming book, but it's this idea that God asks Jonah, is your anger a good thing? Right. And I think that's such a good question. And so I bring that up because, there's a lot of anger, right, in a lot of places. But I think, if we echo that question that God asks Jonah, is your anger a good thing? I don't know. Sometimes our anger is a good thing, right? And sometimes it isn't, but sometimes it is. And so I think that, when I think of just for, what I'm seeing or any encouragement, I think, as we move forward and we're discerning, is our anger a good thing or is it not a good thing? Sometimes it is, like I said, sometimes it isn't, but I love that that God even invites us to wrestle with that question and invites us to wrestle with, we should be angry about some things. And I see a lot of anger that to me is, I think, a great thing, and I think it's led us to conversations like these. I think it's led us to, to again, like I mentioned, develop and talk about a theology of abuelitas. And so, those are some of the things that I'm excited and encouraged about.
Well, honestly, when I hear people that don't come from my experience or my center of gravity and they're hopeful, that's giving me an unbelievable amount of hope, because man, if they're hopeful, then I have reason to be hopeful, because they would have even more reason to not be hopeful. I'm learning from that as well, and
it's good.
It's just good to hear you share. I want to ask you this question. It's going to sound like an earlier question that I asked you, Kat, but I loved your answer earlier so much. I'm going to see what you have for me again. I'm going to rephrase the question a second time. But if I want to keep learning from these things, I feel like I want to keep learning from voices like yours, from other voices, from other experiences and other stories. When I get the opportunity to, I mean, you talked about allowing yourself to be a guest. Mm-hmm. If you find yourself as a guest, is there a question that I don't realize I could be asking, a missed opportunity, or should be asking, or when I go to engage, like I'll sit in these moments and I'll I want to learn from this person, and I don't know how to ask the next question. Do you have that gateway question of I don't know. If I knew, I would ask it. But what is that? I sit in this moment where I am a guest, and I realize I'm sitting with somebody that has a holy story, and I don't even know, because all my questions are going to come from my experience and my perspective and my point of reference. Is there a helpful question that I can learn how to ask people that allows them to open up and give me the gift of who they are?
Yeah, I am not exactly sure. And I say that only because, every person and every story and every, relationship is so different. As far as just a general question, and I'll answer your question more specifically in a second, but as far as just a general question, I'm always seeking to ask, and again, I have varying levels of privilege, and so I'm always seeking to ask, where can I, or what can I learn from that I don't expect, I haven't learned from before, I haven't sought out to learn. And that could be something as literally as simple as a tree, right? I have this large oak tree in my backyard, and I live in Nashville now, and I've only lived here for a little over a year, but I've lived here for an entire year where I've seen all 4 seasons. And coming from Miami, I never, saw the seasons. And so I have seen this tree die. I've seen this tree come to life. I've seen this tree bud and flourish. And and so there are so many, I feel like, lessons that I've learned from seeing this tree go through its life cycle, right? Of life and death and rebirth. And so that's been a teacher for me. And so just in general, a question that we can ask, not to a specific person, but, where are we learning, or what are we learning, or whom are we learning from that we wouldn't expect to be a teacher? The oak tree behind my house, right? That's just one thing. Or my child, right? As a 8-month-old baby, or, but then more specifically, when I think of, what can I ask a person? I don't know a specific question, but all I can think of is say nothing, right? Just let folks just let it be what it is. Or B, just tell me more, and that's not necessarily a question, but it's a posture of curiosity, right? To just sit there and invite someone to share more as they're comfortable, of course, but for you to be a safe space so that someone is free to be their full selves. And a lot of times that does involve not specifically saying anything other than just offering your presence, your bodily presence, as a safe space. And I think that, someone, I remember I once shared the idea of being a good guest, and someone said, well, to be a guest, you have to be invited and you have to be wanted. And I thought that was such a good point, right? Because you can't just storm into somewhere and say, well, I'm your guest, right? You have to be wanted and invited. And I think in order to be wanted and invited as a guest, I think it's all about your posture, and it's all about, your posture of humility, your posture of genuine curiosity, of wanting to learn. And I think that that's probably the biggest thing that we can offer, if we're wanting to be good guests, right, is to be wanted, right? But, folks will want us around if we're safe spaces. And so I think that, offering ourselves in that way. I'm sorry I didn't answer your question exactly.
No, I asked it because I didn't know where it would go, and that was just so well said, and yes, it's just perfect. Just more thoughts on guest, and in order to be a guest, you have to be invited and wanted, and man, would that be a prayer that I would be the kind of person that people would. Yeah, that alone is convicting. That's good. I appreciate that, Kat. So, what can we? How can people support the work that you do? Obviously, buy your books and those kind of things. Is there anything else people can do? Is there anything that people need to know? Like, what kind of? This is your shot. We love to give people like an opportunity to just be like, here's this thing that I do, and here's how you can help me. Let's intersect. Let's overlap our networks and help each other do the work that they're doing. So what is it that we need to know about what you've got coming up and how we can help?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, really, listening to my podcast, buying my books, as you said, leaving reviews, leaving reviews for my book and for my podcast, and overall just, sharing something that resonates with you. I mean, you can go to my website, katarmas.com, social media, kat_armas. I love to connect with folks on there. So I would love to have you come and read and engage.
Love it.
What's your favorite social network?
Well, it was Twitter for a long while. And then Twitter, just became Twitter. It just got a little exhausting. I mean, it was always that, but I don't know. Maybe I'm more tired. So I've been on Instagram a little bit more. I feel like it's been a safer space lately, but I don't know. That's shifting too. So who knows?
Yeah, that is the trouble. I think Marty and I are still holding on to Twitter, but I mean, it just seems like everything's on fragile ground. So who knows? But yeah. So I'll have katarmas.com in our show notes, and maybe I'll put your social media links as well. Any other way that people should find you or get connected? I would say, you're on hiatus from your podcast right now, but definitely check out the Protagonistas podcast. There's a big back catalog of interviews to listen to if you haven't started that back up yet by the time we publish our episode. So I would definitely encourage people to do that.
Yep. Thank you so much.
Okay. Marty, any other questions or thoughts before we close it down?
Just grateful, Kat, to have you on. A helpful conversation for me, just personally, let alone everybody else. But selfishly, I just really enjoyed the conversation today, and I'll be better for it. But hopefully everything keeps going well with your future writing endeavors and everything else. But yeah, I just really appreciate you taking time to be with us and talk to us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Okay, everyone, if you want to get a hold of Marty, you can find him on Twitter for the time being at Marty Solomon. I'm at EIBCB. Go to katarmas.com for everything. Kat Armas, her books, her podcast, her social media is all there. You can find more details about our show at BamaDiscipleship.com. So thanks for joining us on the Bama Podcast. We'll talk to you again soon.